Welcome to today's webinar on managing your team's backlog. So before we get into it, let's start with intros. So I'm Sam Doctor. I'm a senior product manager here at Shortcut. I've been with the company for over 3 years. Few of my loves, my likes are comedy, cycling, and sushi. And then I'll hand it over to our other co-host, Sarah.
Hey, I'm Sarah Binion. I'm an engineering manager, also 3+ years at Shortcut. I really like horror movies, concerts, and emojis.
Right on. Okay, so let's go over what we'll be covering today during our webinar. First, we'll take a little poll, and then I'll go over backlog management and Shortcut. We'll go into the tool, and then we'll talk through some high-level best practices. Sarah's then going to go over a case study. Then we have a sneak peek of what's coming up in Shortcut, and then we'll definitely have time for Q&A. Good time to call out that there's a Q&A option widget in your toolbar. So if you have a question as we're going through the presentation, feel free to submit one there, and then we'll have that queue ready to go once we hit Q&A. Also, feel free to engage in the chat. You'll also see that we have some resources linked in the resources widget in the lower bar as well. That has some help center articles to reference related to the areas of Shortcut that we're going to be covering today. And with that, let's get started. So first, let's take a poll. What do you find most challenging in managing your backlog? And I'm going to launch the poll right now. You should be able to see it. Go ahead and submit your answers.
Ooh, it's interesting to see the numbers coming in. Definitely different issues. That's cool.
Absolutely. We'll give it a few more seconds for folks to respond.
Also, one thing I wanted to call out is when we do the Q&A, we'll answer the questions at the end. We're probably not going to stop during the process, just to set expectations there.
Good call out. Right. Looks like most folks have responded. So I'm going to end the poll.
Robert D said he is not able to see the polls.
Oh,
I wonder if that was the results or didn't get access to the poll. It should be a pop-out in addition to the window on the Zoom. Well, we can add some of the visibility or not showing up.
okay. Well, looking at the poll, for folks who aren't able to see the results, status and visibility has been called out as one of the main challenges in managing your backlog, followed by priority and alignment, and then grooming and refinement. So we're going to cover these topics during the webinar. And thanks for giving your feedback. If there's something else, please share in the chat. All right. I'm going to move my top bar here so I can close this widget. Awesome. So let's get started on our content. So before we go through some more slides in the deck, let's pop into Shortcut to review how you can actually visualize your backlog in Shortcut if you aren't doing so today, right? So here I'm in Shortcut and I'm on the backlog page underneath all work, but you also have them underneath your teams. And here we have stories shown in the backlog. But here's how you would add a backlog workflow state. So that way you can see stories in your backlog on this page and the stories page. So if I go to settings and then go to workflow states, select the workflow that you want to have backlog states in. And then you can add your states here with this little CTA. And so in this workflow, we have 3 backlog workflow states that represent the process that we have for this team that's using this workflow, or various teams. And then once that's been updated, if you create a story and go into the workflow that you added the states to, you can see those backlog states are there. So when you create stories, you can add them to your backlog. And once that's all set up and you start creating stories, like I said, you can view them on your backlog, or you can view them on the stories page, and you'll see all of the workflow states are here. This can be super powerful in creating a view that's either just focused on your backlog states, or you can filter them out completely if you have spaces that are relevant to other parts of your process. And you can do that by just clicking into the workflow state filter. I've already added it to my filter bar, and selecting the workflow states that you want to see in your space view. So just wanted to cover that on setting up your backlog in Shortcut. Now let's get back to the presentation. So in managing your backlog in Shortcut, right, you're starting with triage feedback that you're gathering from several different inputs, right? You're getting feedback on your product from existing users, from prospects. It could be from your internal team, from research. And this is happening across your entire org. So you want to make sure that you set up the right channels to gather this feedback, and align with your PDE group on those channels and how they're set up. So that can be like setting up your Slack integration, creating stories in Slack, connecting stories to Zendesk tickets. But you may also want to use a separate tool to process all of the opportunities and feedback that you gather, especially if it's a super large volume of feedback, right? So something like product board or cycle. So that way you can start seeing trends and feedback and requests, and then that can determine what you actually push into Shortcut as a backlog item. These channels also include bug triage processes, which Sarah will cover later on in the presentation. And so once you have your channels set up, you'll want to make sure that your backlog items are properly updated, so that way you can organize your backlog in the way that you want. Right, so when you create your backlog item, typically a story, you want to make sure it's in that backlog workflow state like we covered. And then you might want to use your priority field, use custom fields like business area, use t-shirt sizing. You can represent this by using a label. Using labels and epics to organize your backlog stories can be a really good way to group your backlog by specific product areas or business goals. And these fields can help visualize the set priority that your team has, especially if you rely on a specific prioritization framework. But also, super importantly, and that this really helps the person in charge of managing the backlog, that updating your stories helps you create really powerful views, which is what I touched on when we were in Shortcut, like creating a space filtered to the specific area that you want to dial in on when grooming your backlog. And this is what you can take advantage of when you have your stories up to date with the right fields and set priorities. You can either go to the backlog page. One way we recommend viewing your backlog is grouping by priority field, or you can go to the stories page and create a space where you can manage and view your backlog. This is also a really great way if you view your backlog on the stories page and create a shared space. You can share it across your teams. To increase that visibility in your backlog. You could even filter to highest priority items. You could filter to a specific product area. So if you have stakeholders who want to know about specific high priority items in your backlog and where they land, that's how you can create those saved views and share them out. There we go. And once you have your views of your backlog in Shortcut, looking at your items, this is where you can set and manage priority of your backlog stories. things might adjust, right? Depending on your company and team goals, critical paths that are established, and hypothesized business impact, right? You're constantly gathering more information, not just the amount of volume of feedback that you gather from your users for a specific backlog item that might impact priority, but also if business goals adjust, if team targets adjust, you'll also want to manage your backlog and adjust priority based off of those inputs. And that's definitely something we do internally. Another part of this process in grooming your stories is making sure that your backlog items and those stories that you have set have acceptance that are ready to pick up for development, right? And so you can move those stories into an unstarted workflow state. This might be the point where you have a user story in your backlog that should be an epic, right? It might be a feature, and that's where you can actually add a workflow state in for your epics to represent a backlog, put that epic there, and then you can put it in your roadmap for your team um, and show that priority there for more visibility into those larger items. This process really helps with your team in staying aligned on what's ready to be picked up, but it also smooths out that process when you and your engineering partner and your designer come together and plan for your next sprint and review your roadmap and the set priority for epics that might be in your backlog state. And I'll summarize a bunch of best practices later on in the presentation, but I want to hand it over to Sarah, who's going to cover a case study on backlog management. I'm going to stop my share. Oops, Sarah, I think you're on mute.
Perfect. All right, cool. Hello. So I am going to use the stories page to show how we do our backlog management because I really like the powerful filters. So I want to step you through a process of how we bug triage and add bugs to our iterations and also to prioritize for later. So I'm going to show you how I can set up spaces and follow engineering and product managers to give visibility so that we can see bottlenecks and possibly ticket aging. And I'm going to create some categories and checkpoints so that we can revisit things as they get older. So first off here, I'm going to start ticket. So currently I've mapped out how I'm thinking of a bug. So first, we have a bug is reported. Then it goes to our dev on call. And then either that dev on call solves a bug because it's a blocking function, or that it's non-blocking and we're going to potentially put it into the iteration. Here we would like to have a goal of making sure some of the straightforward stuff gets solved within that first 4 weeks. If I also want to put a point of accountability so I can check in on, are there bugs that are growing older than 4 weeks? So if they don't get solved, if they don't get mapped, road mapped into an epic for future prioritization, it might age into bucket 2. Here, I want to make sure that tickets aren't getting older than a quarter. And so if that's the case, why is it aged? Has it not been solved right away? Has it not road mapped? Or is this even a bug and it's just a weird fragment ticket and we should just archive it because we can't reproduce it or someone forgot to fill out the bug because that happens. So this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to set up spaces on our on our stories page for everybody to see these. So I'm going to close this ticket. So here, I'm going to go to all work outside of teams, but within the all workspace. So I can see everybody within all the teams within my workspace. And I'm going to go to this first bucket. I'm going to filter by any type of bug created in the last month that is not in an iteration and is not in an epic. So I'll just quick show you. If I do the same filter, engineering bug type, there's a decent amount of bugs in this space. But if I set up this filter, I can see what ones have not been put in iteration and are not epic. So me and the other engineering managers can go, oh, these tickets need a home. Let me grab this and put this on my team. So the second point of accountability that I showed in that mapping was um, if something is older than a month, but less than a quarter. So we have any type of bug lasted 3 months, but not within the first month. So that not the first month, but the second and the third month that are not an epic and no iteration. So I'm still seeing more tickets here. So these tickets, if you notice, are different bugs that are showing up, but this is a different age range. So here is kind of that like moment of we really need to take care of these bugs. They're getting old. Why are they aging? Let me refine these tickets a little bit more, see if I can bring them into an epic or I can bring them into my team. Now, these are the two teams I want to share with my other engineering managers and my other project partners and other engineers. So if they are on dev support or if, they're looking for a bug to like solve really quickly, making sure that everyone knows that this is an area of bugs where we can grab from. Um, I like to make an extra space just for myself, just to make sure things are categorized correctly. So if you notice, the icon is not a shared space, it is myself. And so what I did in this one, just to make sure I have the visibility, is I filtered all bugs that are older than 3 months and that are could possibly be, notice matches any, not matches all, could possibly be an epic or could possibly be or not be in an epic or not be in an iteration. And if we look at this ticket, this one is in an epic, but it's not an iteration. And this one is in an iteration, but not in an epic. So these are probably going along the lines I might want to revisit why we haven't solved these bugs according to my original chart. I either cancel them out, archive them, or just put a little influence with them to make sure that they get on the roadmap. Um, Now that I've created these spaces, I can work with my product partner to create reports to track backlog management to see if, my bugs are growing, shrinking, or maintaining the same size for our um, trajectory. I can share visibility with my workspace to see what's fresh and what's getting stale within our bugs ecosystem. And I can maintain this framework of accountability of I have this, you know, 4 week iteration check or 4 week check-in and then also, quarter check-in. And that helps make sure that we're not losing bugs within our system because sometimes a couple days pass and it's out of sight, out of mind. So having this accountability check-in to make sure things are categorized helps us make sure that we're grouping things and keeping aware of what's in the system. So now let me pass this back to Sam for best practices that hopefully will encompass what I just showed.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to reshare my screen to cover best practices. And then we're nearly at Q&A. Sarah, I see a few questions coming up already. And I also see a hand up. So feel free if you have any questions to add them to the Q&A section, and we'll address those in just a few moments after we cover these pieces. Really excited that everyone has some questions about some of the topics that we've covered during this webinar so far. So just to summarize, things that we've covered and we recommend for backlog management and shortcut. Considering team and company goals, using business outcomes to help inform the priority of your backlog. So confidence level and hypothesis, and does this backlog item impact key user flows in your product? Same with maintaining alignment, right? So providing updates on the status of your team's backlog on a regular cadence. You can do this for both epics and for backlog stories. So if you have epics in your backlog, you can share a PNG export of your team's backlog and other channels. We actually linked a recording of a previous webinar we had just on road mapping and shortcut. So it covers that and also other recommendations for roadmap visibility, which can help with communicating your backlog of larger items. But for backlog stories, so stories that are in workflow states associated with the backlog type, you can share saved spaces, so that way folks can see the status of those items. For that. And then we also recommend holding time for grooming. I do this at least once a month. I put a block on my calendar. And I also have a space that's in my tab list that's just ready to go. Um, so that way, when it's time for me to review backlog items, I just click into that tab and I'm ready to go. I can also link that space in the calendar invite. And one last call out is monitoring for critical paths and quick wins when adjusting the priority of your backlog items, right? So not just the volume of feedback that you gather from your various channels about specific backlog items, but also if you're working on specific projects and there are critical paths identified, make sure that you adjust your backlog so that way when you go into sprint planning or iteration planning, you're ready to go. The other benefit of having your backlog groomed and reviewed and priority has been adjusted based off of current information is that, let's say your team's in the middle of an iteration and you have extra capacity, you can feel confident that if they pull items from your backlog, that the stories that they pick up are still contributing to your team and company goals and quick wins. Also, before we get to Q&A, wanted to call out our sneak peek is subtasks. This is a new feature that we're currently working on. It's in development, and we're really excited about this new functionality. Our hope is that bringing in subtasks will help with that groom and refinement moment of user stories, right? So let's say you have a backlog user story that we know will deliver value, and we're going to break it down for development. You can use subtasks to break that user story down into pieces of work that your development team can pick up and move across workflow states that you can also view in all the areas of Shortcut where you can view stories. And with that, we will jump to Q&A. I'm going to stop share. Awesome. One other call out is we have a Shortcut Slack community. If you'd like to join, I'm going to enable that link now. So go ahead and join our Slack community if you have more questions later on, or if you want to engage with us. All right, let's take a look at the Q&A queue. Okay. Also, Itamar, I see that you've raised your hand. If you haven't already, go ahead and add a question to the Q&A, or we'll have you come on after we get through a list of questions that we already have. All right, so the first one is from Becky Steele. One of the biggest challenges I have to status and visibility of the backlog is that stories are blocked, but not because of another story. Examples, a person needed to pair on the issue is on vacation, or there's a plan to add either a free text function to the relationship function. Okay. Or visual that can live on the table view. Okay. Right. So I think for this question, it looks like, Becky, you currently do blocked in the story title. Subtasks might help here with this use case. I don't know what you think, Sarah, for this example.
I think it depends. Well, you're closer to the product on the subtask, so I don't know what the current proof of concept is looking like right now. But when I like Becky's solution of the blocked with a label. I do know that we do have a dependency visualizer now if you go to the detail pages. So that is sometimes helpful to see that relationship. But I don't know if we have anything on the roadmap at this time to specifically, I assume this is like make it bold or put some kind of visual treatment other than a label. I don't think we have anything at this time, but we both work on the stories page, so I can take that a note as something that you would like to see.
Yeah, and Becky, there's a link in our resources to sign up for early access to subtests, and that's for everyone here on the Zoom. So if you want to get early access to this feature and try it out for your team, um, you can sign up using that link in our resources section. Okay.
I see the next one, anonymous attendee. What's the difference between stories and backlog under all work? I was ready for this question.
Go for it.
Um, stories, backlog was built originally to support some of the limitations of our original stories page. So I like stories page. We're just building it. We're getting close to GA. I know some people see it, can visit a legacy version if you were grandfathered into using shortcut for a long period of time. But I really like the filter functionality that comes with the stories page. So for me, for handling the triaging, I really enjoy the stories page view. And we'll probably need to revisit the backlog view. But the main category is on backlog. You just see stories that have the workflow state of backlog. I hope that answers your question.
And feel free to follow up if you have any additional questions on that, but very well said, Sarah. Awesome. All right, the next one from Anne. I manage the support team for an ed tech company, and we are just switching from ClickUp to being on the same instance of Shortcut with our engineering team. Cool. Haven't set up the workflow yet. Any recommendations on how to set up a workflow for a support team? Awesome. So I'll share a few thoughts that I have, and then Sarah, if you have anything else that you'd like to add. So in terms of setting up your workflow, it really depends on how your team currently works, especially with your engineering team as they're already in Shortcut. So you might want to go into Shortcut and review their workflow and how they move tickets through the board, and then think about how your process is. In terms of managing a backlog, just making sure that there's at least one state, but it is nice to have at least two. So that way you have a backlog workflow state that's a bucket of tickets that haven't been reviewed yet by your team. And then once it has been reviewed, you move it into your official backlog state before it gets moved into ready for development. What I'm going to do here actually in our resources is share a link to schedule time with our customer success group. So that way, Anne and anyone else who has questions like this, you can sit down with a Shortcut team member and talk through your process and actually go into your Shortcut instance and set everything up live. But also feel free to ask questions in our Slack community if you'd like to discuss something async as well. So I'm going to share that resource too.
I do have one note. One thing I like to do when I work with different groups of different teams, I like to make sure that I have like alignment with each of my team members, and we'll sit down and um like as you see on my board here, right? I'm gonna share real quick. Um, we have a few workflow states. We have draft ready for refinement, ready for development, and development ready for review done. And I try to go with my team and go, what is the entrance criteria and the exit criteria for a ticket to enter into the draft and what it takes to leave a draft. I think if you can get your team to have buy-in on what it is, it'll make sure that um, people understand the intention of each column. And digital ink is not dry. Feel free to delete a workflow state if it doesn't make sense for your team. There's no right and wrong answer. It's how your team moves clearly. And one thing is, another thing too, is when I talked about the entrance and exit criteria, we do have some documentation that you can put for the workflow states to have descriptions for the entrance and acceptance criteria. And that could be something that is part of the onboarding conversation for your team as you switch out different members. But I find that is very helpful for me for crafting something that works for my team specifically. I mean, your team specifically, Anne. Thank you. Next
So,
question.
all right, the next one we have is from Jacob. Does the team at Shortcut use different workflow states for product versus engineering teams? From Sam's example earlier, it seemed the product was grooming the backlog stories using multiple states in a shared workflow. Really curious how the team at Shortcut manages their own backlog. This is a really great question, Jacob. And I'm also going to echo what Sarah said, is that this is something that even internally we set our workflow, we manage stories that come through. And if we find that there are opportunities to optimize our process, we do so. So we do have a workflow that is set for our engineering teams or development teams that we use across teams, as our teams are set by specific product areas currently. And that's typically the main workflow that's used for visualizations. We do have backlog states in that workflow to manage that main process for most of the stories that we take on, not for just projects, but also for bug triage, like Sarah walked us through. We also have a separate workflow for non-technical projects, for example, marketing, design, or product. And that we use mainly just to separate stories, right? For example, if a designer has a story for, working on a specific design, they'll move it through that separate workflow. So that way, once it gets moved into our main workflow that our developers are working off of, they know, okay, this story is in an unstarted state. It's ready to move into a started state for development versus that separate workflow for designers. But that's something that we're still reviewing and adjusting. We also know that the ability to view more than one workflow, for example, on the stories page, is something that folks have been asking about and we know would bring value. So that's something we're also exploring for down the line. But it depends on the size of your workspace, depends on how many teams you have and your process. So hopefully that answers your question. Sarah, do you have anything to add there?
I would say along with that is there are some customifications. Like I know on the engineering workflow internally at Shortcut, we use a lot of like the automatic verbs that are tagged with GitHub so that engineers can move stories automatically as we get a ticket review or get something deployed or so having those automations really helps the developers who I remember when I was doing more on coding teams that I didn't always update my ticket stories with the most recent status, and it helps me not get in trouble. And so I really like those automations. So I feel like maybe having different workflows like that. I know some of our designers code, they could set up their own keywords so that as they move to different acceptance criteria, they would be able to automate their processes the way they want. But yeah, I second what Sam said. Hopefully that gave you enough uh, information on that.
Awesome. All right, next question from Anonymous. After you groom and refine a story, do you move it back to backlog until it's pulled into a sprint? Well, Sarah, do you want to pick this one up first?
Sure. I really like a horizontal movement on a board. I try not to move tickets backwards. So I like to move something from draft to ready from it to development. Uh, if something goes into the backlog, for me, it's kind of like an icebox feature. I try to keep things ready for refinement. If it has acceptance criteria and if it's documented, I don't put things into ready for development until I've had a conversation with developers and that they are ready to take it into the sprinter iteration. So that is kind of what I do. I know nobody wants to hear that the backlog tends to be something that is a little bit of an icebox, but I have pulled things out of the backlog before. But that is my status on it. How about you, Sam? How do you move the through the board?
Yeah, I think the way that you described it aligns with how I envision it as well. I think, something to think about when you're grooming and refining, like thinking just within your backlog is um, the stories that you have at the very top of your backlog set at high priority or have been adjusted so that they're the first things that get picked up. um, I try to ensure that the acceptance criteria is fully fleshed out. All of the relevant information is there. So that way, when it's broken down for development, it's a pretty smooth process. And so that's something that I always try to ensure when I'm updating my backlog. So um, you can move a story and I'd hopefully not move it back or shelf it. And keep things more efficient that way. So hopefully that's helpful for the anonymous question. Let's do the next one. Looks like we still have a good amount of time. Um, all right, from an anonymous attendee, hi. Not directly related to backlog management, but still, any plans on expanding the activity feature set? There's an option to filter mentions. It would be great to add an option to filter comments by author, or at least to see a comment you left, or at least to see a comment you left in the story recently. I've noticed that I spent some time trying to find comments I left for our dev team. Thanks for sharing this feedback. The activity feed is something that we know could be optimized for teams' workflows, definitely. So we'll take this feedback with us and we'll share it with our team internally. We don't have anything planned in the immediate term, but as we bring in solutions to help teams communicate and collaborate in Shortcut, activity notifications in the product is a part of that experience, and we're taking that into account. So this feedback is super important for us to know what to prioritize once we get to solving for those problems. So really appreciate the feedback and also sharing the context on that. Um, awesome. All right, next one from Krista. Are there many instances of Shortcut clients using the product for creative projects like product design, build out of design systems, or prototyping? Really great question. Um, if we had one of our customer success leads on the call, I think they'd be able to give a more concrete answer to that with numbers behind it. There are folks that use Shortcut for these use cases. Definitely possible to do so. And there are also integrations in Shortcut with Figma. You can create mermaid charts. So you can see things live in Shortcut as well when you paste links into stories. And if you have more questions about that specific use case, feel free to book some time with us. You can sit down and talk through the best way to use Shortcut for product design and designing and prototyping.
I was going to show the one, if you
Yeah,
do look at that description, that illustration that I made where I mapped out the process, I made that in a mermaid chart. And so being able to just map that process out and share it was some collaboration. I know that we are Figma embeds can also be displayed not as granular, but you can see Miro and Figma in a similar level so that you um, have visual collaboration. But in terms of like a canvas board for scribbling, I don't think we have that at this time.
so N+1. All right, two more that we have in the queue. Jacob, we have multiple product areas that share a marketing releases slash versioning. Example, February 2025 release. Do you guys see labels or custom fields for this kind of thing at Shortcut? Really good question. We've used labels to do this just because we find that using labels for something like dates is a bit more sustainable. You can also go in and view labels in Shortcut. Let me share real quick here. So if you go into settings and then go to labels, you can, well, these labels aren't necessary. Here we go, release 1.0. And so if you had stories or epics that had this label, you could view them all. So if you were using labels for releases, then you could click into that release label and you'd see all the stories listed. Custom fields, you can create that visualization across Shortcut and tables and on the stories page. You can also filter down to labels on the stories page pretty efficiently as well. But just because labels, you have a bit more flexibility in the what you write in, and for dates, definitely a good solution there. But great question, and thanks for asking about release management. And Sarah, go ahead.
I strongly second labels. But if you actually go to bug_label, that one has a little bit more robust because you can see the completion chart of that and the burn down charts. I can share my screen because I think you wanted to show one that in this particular demo space, we
Perfect.
have how it's completed. So we can see the list of stories here. You can change what's shown, and then you can see some of the activity on the charts. I really like the reports page for the labels, so I can track some of that stuff. Um, Also, one thing to put the weight behind the labels, custom fields right now is a little bit robust of an option because that page isn't paginated. Sometimes it can get wieldy if you have more than 100 options. So I would definitely recommend labels on that one.
Definitely good call outs. Awesome. All right. And last question in the queue from Natalie. We're designing an all new workflow. What's the best way to move stories from the old workflow to the new? Okay, so I'm going to show you a view that I think you can go to get started on that. This is also something where if you connect with support, Natalie, so support@shortcut.com and send a ticket. Our team will gladly help you if you want to do this live with them or if you run into any issues. And they also have a lot of best practices for this specific thing, because you're not the only one who wants to do this and adjust their process. But let me just quickly share to show where this page is here. Okay, so if you go into the search bar, there's an advanced story search page, and then you can search by the specific workflow state and then bulk update those stories in this demo space. That's probably the best way to bulk update, depending on how many stories you have in that workflow. Otherwise, you can also go into the new stories page, which operates much faster and bulk update stories this way. But also, I would recommend connecting with us if you have more specific questions or run into any issues there.
Off the top of my head, one heads up on that page with the bulk update on the Kanban. I believe right now, I, Sam, double check me on this one. Is it 500 or 5,000 is the max items that we can update in a column?
Um,
I
we've
think it's
set
500.
We've set to 500 per column, so you'd have to do it in chunks. If you have more than that in your state. So that's definitely something to consider when you go in and move everything. But again, if you have a lot of stories that need movement, please connect with us because we can work with you to make the process much smoother. Uh,
And I hope you don't have 500, but just in case, I wanted to throw that out there.
Depending on the state. Awesome.
Cool. I think we got a lot of the questions. Thanks, Josh, for also calling out a feedback out there of use a red flag emoji or something like that to give you visual on the title. I enjoy the emoji labels as well. They also have reports, so awesome. And then thank you everybody for your great questions.